Well, welcome from the Owen School and the Law School to today's session on sustainability. And it's a rainy day in Nashville, but a great day. Well, we're about halfway through the semester for all of those alumni out there. You know what it's like mid-March. Everyone gets a little bit stir crazy about this time of year. The Owen School, we transitioned from Mod 3 to Mod 4, which we have been doing on a very compressed break this year. But today the students had a last day off and have been participating in a day we call Owen Impact Day, all morning working on projects with our Center for Social Ventures in the local community, working with local nonprofits. And then this afternoon, a really tremendous set of sessions around sustainability, and an issue that's incredibly important, growing in importance in so many ways. And we're really delighted to bring together three different sessions here this afternoon, starting off with a session that really is going to be setting the context. And I've invited Professors Vandenbergh and Professors Cohen to join me today to talk a little bit about the context for sustainability, and particularly around the business imperative of sustainability. But I've also asked them to give a little bit of a historical arc because it's a subject that we've been thinking about for a long time. And I think one of the things that's really exciting about having Mike and Mark with us here today is they are truly pioneers in this space, really both in the law school and in the business school, creating curriculum and programming and thinking about from their own research an issue long before it was such a big issue. I mean, in the sense that I would say long before it was cool in a certain way, they were working on this issue and really leading in this space as pioneers in the space. And so I asked them to come set the context in the next 25 minutes or so. And then we'll have two different panels. We're really focused on the energy side of sustainability today, though the context setting that we're doing right now will be a little broader than that. But we'll have two different panels that look at the portfolio and portfolio mix, both at kind of a corporate level, how you make decisions at a corporate level, and then a broader kind of policy level, what it means for regions of the country. And so, well, given on the back of many of the things going on, even from just the rolling blackouts that Texas experienced during their freak winter storm, this issue is something that's on a lot of people's minds, thinking about what energy portfolio mixes look like and how to make good decisions around that to create a sustainable and reliable future. So that's what the afternoon is going to be about. But I want to start with our faculty, and we'll start with Professor Mark Cohen. Mark has been a longtime member of the Owen faculty, and many of the alum will remember him. I tease Mark because I can remember him teaching classes on sustainability back in the 90s, which were pretty small classes at that time. In some sense, the real diehards, as it were, that would come and take those classes. That's not true anymore. And I spoke in one of Mark's classes just a week or so ago and was amazed to see that what was a couple handful of students had turned into 2 sections and 100+ students over time, really touching more than half of our MBA students every year, just in that one course alone. And it really does kind of match the arc of interest around this subject in the business school. And so Mark's going to start off by helping us understand a little bit of what that has meant for curriculum at Owen, but the topic in general, and then the curriculum. And we'll do the same thing with Mike, because he's done almost an identical path over in the law school, and the two have been partners in many different endeavors over the last few years, which I'm sure they'll share along the way. So Professor Cohen, I will turn it to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Eric, thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate the chance to sort of lead this whole afternoon discussion off, which looks really fascinating. And I look forward to hearing all the other speakers this afternoon.
One thing, Mark, before you get rolling too far, I realized failed to tell everyone that the preferred way to watch this is in gallery view. So if you go up into your upper right-hand corner under view and gallery view, you'll kind of get the best design as we intended it. But of course, you can do whatever you want. Back to you, Mark.
Sure, thanks. Well, anyways, what I want to do very briefly is go back in time just a little bit, because I think it is important to understand the historical context. For many of you listening to this, you are recent grads, and the history may not be, you may not think it's as important, but it is, and I'll show you why. And for those of you who were in school 20 or 30 years ago, I want to show you what's progressed since that time. So Sharon, if you could put the slides up, let's just start with the first one. There we go. So I like to show this to my classes, and this is something, it's now getting dated. It's 2011. I haven't found a more recent survey, but this was 4,000 global corporate executives, and it was a survey done by Boston Consulting Group and Sloan Management Review. And what they asked was, when did the topic of sustainability first appear on your organization's management agenda? And so what you can see is this very, very flat time period. I mean, basically before around 2000, early 2000s, it was essentially nobody. And now if you start to look at what was going on, 1984 was the Bhopal incident in India, where the chemical plant blew up, and it really sort of woke up the entire world to the potential hazards of chemicals and things like that. But it really wasn't a sustainability issue. It really was much more of a risk operations management kind of issue. You see the Exxon Valdez, similar in 1989. There was huge amounts of pollution, but internally what organizations largely did was they focused on how do I control that in the future? How do I reduce the risk? What kind of operations, engineering protocols and things like that do I need? 1992 was the Earth Summit, the first Earth Summit in Rio, where climate change first became a global issue. You see that little tiny arrow without any text. That's me, 1993, the first time I offered a course on management of environmental issues, is what I called it at the time. You can see it was right around that time. I actually came to Owen around 86, teaching some other related courses. But the first time that we offered a course here at Owen on environmental sustainability issues, interestingly enough, I had a guest speaker just focusing on climate and what the uncertainties are, what the risks were for business, et cetera. And these are all very business-oriented courses, but what you see is, again, very little uptake in terms of the C-suite. Brent Spar, if any of you remember that was the big oil rig off the North Coast. That was, without going into all the detail, it was a big PR mess. It was 1995. It was when Shell had thought they were doing what the government asked them to do, but yet Greenpeace objected to it. And in fact, there was a huge outcry, and it was a PR nightmare, even despite the fact that Shell thought they were doing the best thing with Brent Spar, and they went to the government and got their approval. It became a nightmare for the company from a PR perspective, and that's something I think that Mike will touch upon later, with sort of the beyond government side of things as well, beyond the legal side of things. Kyoto Protocol, so you can see the difference between Rio and Earth Summit. The Earth Summit in 92, and then 97 was the first real international agreement on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Starting around that time, we start to see a shift where businesses starting to bring more and more into sustainability issues into the C-suite. And you can see the dramatic increase starting around the mid 2000s. That by 2011, 60% of companies said that it was a C-suite issue. Now it's probably more like 80 or 90%, I don't know. But what does that mean for managers and for companies? Think about who's running most companies. Okay, if you're 55, except for the newest companies, the new high-tech companies, if you're running an outline company, you're 55 to 60 years old, nothing wrong with that. It just, if you got an MBA or an engineering degree, it was 25, 20, 30 years ago. It was in that time period where these issues were never taught in business schools. Yes, I was teaching it in 93, but as Eric suggested, there were not that many students. And we were one of only a handful, probably about 25 business schools at the time, who were offering courses like this. So it was certainly not a mainstream business topic. Next slide, please. So where are we today? Well, this is a 2015 survey by BCG and Sloan Management, 3,000 global corporate executives. And what they asked is pursuing a sustainability-oriented strategy necessary to be competitive? And you can see that a majority, 58%, say yes, sustainability strategy is necessary to be competitive. And even for those who didn't say yes, 30%, 29% said not yet, but not currently, but yes in the future. Only 10% said no. So that's a very overwhelming change. Again, going to these corporate executives, majority saying it's necessary. Now move on to the next slide, please. And here's what, again, just 2 years later, 2017, this was the most recent BCG survey. And what it asked is whether or not a sustainability strategy is important to remaining competitive. And 90% say yes. So you can see even went from about 60% to about 90% in just a couple of years. It's a similar question. So 90% of companies consider sustainability strategy important to remaining competitive. But that's sort of the one side. Then you go down to the next issue, which is, well, how many of them really have a sustainability strategy? And 60% claim they do. So there's a big gap. But now what about the last part? 25% of businesses say that they actually have a business case for sustainability, which tells you there's a huge disconnect from the strategy perspective. Companies are doing this, but most companies don't have a real business case for why they're doing it. Is it competitive? Does it really help the bottom line? Do they understand the strategic implications? So that's what we focus on. You can put the slides down now. I want to just talk for a few minutes about what's been going on at Owen. But you can see that's sort of the context for this, and what it means both from a teaching perspective and from a management perspective is that boards of directors are now focusing on sustainability across the board. Investors, we know this. I mean, we hear about this more and more in the news today, but there is sort of a lag in education. There's a lag in bringing people up to that C-suite level, and so the knowledge base isn't always there. And that's really, I think, been an interesting problem. Well, what's happened very quickly, and then I'm going to turn over to Mike, but very quickly, what's happened at Owen is, as Dean Johnson suggested, I mean, it was a low, I wouldn't say it was as low as he suggests. I did get a lot of students, but it would be 15 or 20 students in a class, maybe 25. Actually, I will say in the early days, it was kind of more interesting in the sense that I have an awful lot of real debate, because half the class were probably climate deniers and half the class were not. So it wasn't just at first anyway, there were those who were taking the class because they were curious. But I think over time, that sort of dwindled. I think those students kind of said, no, that's really not for me. But what's happened now is we have a core course, which I call Corporate Strategies for Environment, Social, and Governance, or ESG. That becomes the pillar for an emphasis at Owen. So you can get a sustainability and social impact emphasis. We have a second course that I've been teaching, financial analysis of ESG data, where we're looking at metrics, what actual metrics are used. How do you start to look at those metrics in terms of the balance sheet, in terms of stock valuation, in terms of risk reduction, those kinds of things. We have a course on the future of energy markets in a low carbon economy, which is really more the rest of the afternoon session, where we have, we look at wind and solar, and we look at nuclear. We look at various low carbon options. And again, these are strategic courses because they focus on what are the opportunities and risks for businesses. And then I will finish it up by turning it over to Mike and say that Mike and I, for quite a few years now, have taught a course jointly at the law school and business school. It's one of the most fun things I do, which is we get a group of students together from the law school and the business school, and we focus on the climate change and what are the business and legal implications. Essentially, what are the business implications, both from a strategy side and a law side, of climate change. So that's where we're at. The growth in student demand, I'll leave it with this, and it is true, I think, as Eric suggested. I noticed just in the last couple of years, of 2017-18 timeframe, in the core class, I had 28 students. The following year, I had 47 students, and in the following year, 47 students. In 2020 and 21, this past academic year, I had 84 students over 2 sections. So it's a really significant jump. And it means that 30 or 40% of our graduating class will have taken at least one of these classes, which I'm really quite happy about. Anyways, let me turn it over to Mike, and thanks for your time.
Great. Thank you, Mark. And it has been an absolute privilege to work with Mark Cohen. As many of you know, you've had his classes. He's one of the leading experts and a true pioneer. It's also been great to collaborate with Dean Johnson and with the Owen School over the years. I think that's been a true synergy between the law school and the Owen School, both in terms of curriculum and research and impact on the community. So I'm just really excited to be here. And let me say a word about my perspective, and then let's talk about the state of law in this area and the state of the environmental curriculum as we try to merge business and legal interests. I've been at Vanderbilt since 2001. Before that, I was a partner at Latham & Watkins, a large global law firm. I represented investment banks and private equity firms and Fortune 100 companies. Before that, I was the EPA Chief of Staff during the Clinton administration, and I ended up in that job in part because I was on the team of lawyers that evaluated vice presidential candidates for Bill Clinton, and my team was headed by someone who was a fairly unwell known or not well known Washington lawyer at the time, a guy named Ron Klain. So that's how I ended up in these areas with experience in business and law, and on the private side and the government side. And to some extent, the experience at the law school on environmental and sustainability issues is parallel to what Mark just described, but on some level, it's the obverse at the same time. And our challenge for lawyers is not the importance of environmental protection in the first place. We've seen that for a long time. The challenge is the mental model or conception of what environmental law and policy is. And I've got a book with Jonathan Gilligan, a physicist at Vandy, where we tackle that, called Beyond Politics. And Sharon, let's go ahead and put up the first slide. And this, I think, captures the mental model that almost all environmental law students come to the classroom with. And frankly, that dominates much of the thinking of policy advocates and professors as well. And that is that environmental law is just a field of public law. And if that's true, we're number one. And why is that? On the left is the famous tax code, remarkable for its complexity. On the right is the environmental code from the Code of Federal Regulations. And as you can see, the environmental code is almost twice as long as the tax code. Now, this is the standard conception that we come to the table with, but Mark and I, for 20 years, have been trying to help people get beyond what I think of as a failure of imagination here. And why is that true? Well, let's go to the next slide and see what the problem is. Because if environmental law is statutes and regulations governing environmental conduct, and that's all it is, then we have a problem, because we had roughly 24 environmental statutes in the first 20 years of environmental law, 1970 to 1990. Since 1990, we've arguably either had none or just one. And so if you're managing a business or a university or a nonprofit organization, you've got a general public that is looking for more action on the environmental side. It might be to scale it back and to make it more cost effective, or it might be to expand to deal with kind of problems like climate change that we often focus on. But in either event, you've got shareholders and employees and customers and investors and lenders, all of whom are looking for some type of sustainability or environmental protection, but the pump has not been primed on environmental protection since about 1990. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll try to understand a little bit about why that's true and why that's so important for an environmental and sustainability curriculum across Owen and the law school. This is the set of scores from the legal conservation voters which is essentially scoring how green the members of Congress are. And you can see the blue across the top are the members of the House and Senate from 1970 to the present. The red on the bottom are the Republicans. And what you can see is that there was a fair amount of bipartisanship in terms of voting on environmental issues until right after about 1990. Frankly, right around the time I became the EPA chief of staff. And what you see is this massive gap opening up. Now, the correlation here doesn't prove causation, but notice how closely that 1990 time period is with the end of the generation of major new pollution control statutes. So what we end up with then is a great deal of public sentiment. People have preferences for environmental protection, but the federal pipeline of new statutes is not feeding that, not satisfying that. And I think you can say that it is likely a polarization that's a piece of that, and a piece of that in turn is what is often called solution aversion. In other words, when Gallup polls people, roughly 2/3 of the American population says that big government is the biggest problem we face. Bigger than big corporations, bigger than big labor. It's the biggest problem we face. But the research that we've done shows that when people hear about private sector action on climate change, they actually get more interested, even folks who are on the moderate to conservative end of the political spectrum, more interested in dealing with a problem like climate change when you can bypass that solution aversion. So let's go to the next slide then. And so what we've seen is just an absolute explosion in corporate activity. The UN recently said that as of 2000, more than 6,000 businesses have made climate commitments, and they represent 40% of global GDP. The Carbon Disclosure Project, known as CDP, has $106 trillion in assets under management behind it, and it recently induced 10,000 companies to report their greenhouse gas emissions. And we could go on and on about this, but I think what's exciting is that Mark and I have been working in these areas, studying why this is happening, studying what this means for business managers and for lawyers. And I think that the difference between what's going on in law and business is that lawyers are scrambling for relevance on some level. It used to be that if you simply knew how to challenge a regulation or how to adopt one, you knew what you needed to know, and that's within the wheelhouse of most lawyers. The challenge today is that an environmental lawyer may be advising on fiduciary duties, or it may be advising on supply chain contracting provisions in the environment. And that's a very different kind of thing. And we've been at the forefront, I think, in teaching about those kind of concepts now for 2 decades. I'd also say that one thing we advise environmental lawyers to do is to become energy lawyers. So I think this afternoon's programs are particularly important. And we have on our faculty, Jim Rossi, who is the most cited environmental or energy law scholar rather, and he'll be participating in the program this afternoon. So that's how we're trying to meet the challenge. Now the challenge can be overwhelming. It can lead to pessimism on some level. And so I want to go to the last slide because pessimism does none of us any good. Let's go ahead and click through to both pictures here. On the left there, what you see is New York City, a common streetscape, all horses, Easter 1900. We go 13 years forward and you don't see a horse there, right? So we as a country made this massive transformation in our transportation system over that period. And my view is that we're at the cusp of a similar transformation right now. And my hope is that the kind of courses we teach, the research we do, the kind of engagement we can have today is helping to actually provoke and facilitate that change rather than trying to resist it. And so I'm actually very optimistic about the kind of transformation that will occur and what our graduates will be able to do as a part of that transformation moving forward. And I've tried to be a little bit brief here because I think these kinds of back and forth exchanges, which to be honest with you, Mark and I specialize in our classes. If we don't have one good argument, at least once each class, I think we haven't had a successful class because we take different perspectives in some cases as an economist and a lawyer. And I'm hoping we can, in the last few minutes of our program today, have a little bit of a back and forth on these issues as well.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for setting that context. That picture at the end is always stunning to me. And I think, wow, what a difference a few years could make. Even when it sometimes feels like things are going slow, it really can take off. But we've got some questions coming in from the audience. So I'll put a couple of them out there, and we'll spend the last 2-3 minutes talking about them. But the first one came in from Stacy Springer, and she asks, when students and companies start to realize that sustainability is more than just the E part of ESG, do you see it gaining in popularity and acceptance? And she goes on to say, at her company, which is oil refining, education and ESG has made a tremendous difference in the narrative and importance of sustainability.
Yeah, Stacey, it's a good question. I think the answer is simply yes. As I said, in fact, when I first started teaching my class, I called it management of environmental issues. I wasn't even able to use the word sustainability for a number of reasons. It was such a hot button issue. But what I will say is my courses have morphed to the point where I spend a class or two on racial discrimination and diversity. I spend a class or two on human rights and the supply chain. So it is not just about sustainability, but the frameworks that I use in my class, the corporate strategy frameworks and thinking about them are virtually identical. And so it starts from a much broader perspective of thinking about, a lot of it goes back to Michael Porter, quite frankly, and some of his work on shared value and things like that. But anyways, so the answer is yes, it does. I think it makes a lot of difference. And I'm not attracting just students who are interested in the sustainability side.
And I think that a fascinating question will be whether on the social and governance side, we can bypass some of the political polarization we've seen in America on some of those issues if the issues are focused through the lens of corporate behavior rather than government behavior. I think that's an open question. I think it'll be
Yeah, it is. And let me just add one quick thought too, and that is because I didn't address the governance side. When I teach on the governance side, one of the things that we start with the more general issue of good governance and alignment of shareholders and managers and those kinds of things. We spend a little time on that, but we then quickly come down to the question of how does governance affect the sustainability of a company? So are the incentives aligned in that respect? Does the board of directors take into account sustainability? What's the role of the firm? All those kinds of issues. So yes, I mean, it definitely helps to have that broader perspective.
Picking up on that, Milt Capps wrote in a little bit about the ongoing kind of SEC rulemaking around ESG disclosure and of course, companies pushing back on that rulemaking process. But it made me actually think, and a fun one to kind of close in is there were a lot of big companies on those slides that went by earlier. But what about all the small companies in this space? How do you see that sustainability playing out in a small company, in a startup, and where are the opportunities for those who are looking for those type of opportunities?
Well, let me just jump in real quick, and that is that look, there's been a generational shift. I mean, we really didn't see it, but we all know about it. I mean, in terms of employees, you talk to your prospective employees, they care about this stuff. And so if you want to attract good talent, you need to worry about it. And the other side is that the idea of niche marketing, in some sense, there's been huge shift in opportunities on sustainability. It's not just a PR marketing side, but in developing products that are more sustainable, there's huge market opportunities. And so that's where a lot of the growth is happening, quite frankly.
And I think from a small business side, I think we'll be seeing a lot of supply chain contracting initiatives begin to influence. So if a large company's adopted a standard and then its 10,000 suppliers are all subject to that standard on some level through supply chain and procurement, that's going to be a really interesting next step and something we're heavily invested in. I've also just finished a study of corporate disclosures of climate issues, and I think I'm happy with any of your alums to share that if they're interested. And I found that about a third of the Fortune 100 were disclosing the kind of private initiatives that we're talking about here, but about 2/3 weren't. And in many cases, the firms were very similarly situated. So it seemed more to be part of a mental model issue than it did whether they were actually subject to material risks from reputation campaigns or supply chain campaigns or things like that. So we have some ongoing work right now that we try to bring into the classroom on these kinds of issues.
And both Mike and I talk about disclosure issues quite a bit in our class, and that's really one of the huge parts of it, frankly.
Fantastic. Well, 30 minutes goes like a blink. But you have wonderfully set the context for the afternoon. Professor Mark Cohen, Professor Mike Vandenbergh, I thank you so much for helping us start off our afternoon around sustainability. And for all those participants, I invite you back to the next panel. It starts at 1 o'clock. And we're going to have a really interesting talk about energy mix and really thinking about what that energy mix decision looks like at a corporate level or individual firm level, and bringing in both provider side like Matt Beasley, who's the Chief Commercial Officer for Silicon Ranch, to the electric delivery side. Aaron is joining us from TVA, and then from the corporate side, Ashley will be joining us from Nike, and Eric Kopstein from Vanderbilt because of some really interesting work that we've been doing here on campus. So I hope to see you at 1 o'clock. Know that for now, if you're interested in viewing this broadcast, it'll be all recorded and put up on the website, and you can pass it along to others. So thanks so much for joining. And thank you, Mike and Mark, for making a great start to our afternoon.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks for the invitation. Appreciate it.